What's going on, everyone? My name's Ethan and welcome to the Fandom Hub. Recently, I've been rewatching one of my all-time favorite shows, Gravity Falls, and I've decided to rank all of the episodes from worst to best. I actually started my YouTube career back when I was a kid with a Gravity Falls channel that actually became rather successful, so let's just say this is a bit nostalgic making content like this again. This video took days to script and edit, so I'd really appreciate it if you guys would take the time out of your day to like and subscribe. In just this past week alone, only 4% of the people who watch my videos were actually subscribed, so help a brother out by hitting that subscribe button and that bell beside it. With all that aside, let's just jump right into the video. Coming in at number 41, The Gulf War. Now, I know what you're thinking, that episode isn't bad, and you'd be right. That's the problem with Gravity Falls, the only problem really. There isn't a bad episode. Some are just lacking a more interesting story than others. Now, for me personally, I wasn't a fan of the Gulf War. The mini golf people were a bit annoying, and it seemed like an episode that depended on its jokes over how interesting the plot actually was. Regardless, still an episode I enjoy from time to time. At number 40, I've got Fight Fighters. Now, I understand how enjoyable this episode might be for people who grew up playing similar fighting games, but I didn't. The nostalgia factor just wasn't there for me. And the plot nor subplot with Mabel and Stan were very interesting for me, to say the least. The only thing this episode really does for the story is establish between Robbie and Dipper that they must hate each other in silence, which makes it feel like a filler episode that once again depends on jokes and gags to carry the story. I can understand why people would love this one, it's just not for me. At number 39, I've got Bottomless Pit. A fun episode, but pretty filler. The only part of this episode I really enjoyed was the Truth-Ake story at the end, because it really happened, and it implemented some funny jokes from Stan. All the other stories were fun the first time I heard them, and then never really did anything for me after that. Oh, except the Grunkle Stan wins the football bowl. That may be my favorite scene from the entire show. But as far as the story progression goes, this episode really doesn't advance the plot much at all. Number 38, SOOS and the Real Girl. Now, this episode is fun. I grew up playing Five Nights at Freddy's from time to time, and this episode clearly draws inspiration from that. I'm not the biggest fan of Giffany, I found her a bit annoying, and as far as the plot goes, I enjoyed it. Melanie is cool and a perfect match for SOOS, but the whole Giffany and animatronics thing didn't really do much for me. Number 37, Little Gift Shop of Horrors. Similar to the Bottomless Pit episode, but way more enjoyable for me. Every little plot was fun, the Hand Witch, Waddles being voiced by Neil deGrasse Tyson, the creative use of claymation in the third one. Overall, just a really fun episode. The only problem, it's a little bit filler. Not bad though. Number 36, The Love God. Not great, not bad. I enjoyed the plot for the most part, but not the Love God character as much. The whole Robbie and Tambry thing I'm okay with, and we get to see Mabel progress as a character, realizing it's not her place to play God in people's lives. The subplot with Stan is one of my favorite parts as well. Some of my favorite humor in the show. At number 35, Boys Crazy. An episode clearly attempting to appeal to those with an obsession with boy bands, which unfortunately is not me. Regardless, it's not a bad episode, and it's one I actually find pretty enjoyable. Number 34, Dipper vs. Manliness. Not a bad episode either, but one that certainly isn't very rewatchable for me. The Dipper become a man plot is entertaining and fun to an extent, but the Mabel and Stan plot just didn't do anything for me. At 33, I've got Irrational Treasure. This episode is kind of a mixed bag for me. I enjoy portions of it and dislike other portions. Specifically Quentin Tremblay. Sometimes I found his jokes funny, and other times he came across as trying way too hard to be random. I can respect that this is a good episode, it's just not one of my favorites. Number 32, Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons. It was a bit weird to return from the craziness of Not What He Seems and Tale of Two Stands with this episode, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It was cool to see a more standard Gravity Falls episode with Ford in the mix. It was funny and creative, and it was cool to see Weird Al voice a character, even if the character was a bit annoying at times. 31, The Deep End. An enjoyable summer episode with a pretty solid plot. Mermando was a fun addition. The Stan vs. Gideon subplot was Stan vs. Gideon at some of its finest, and some pretty standard Season 1 stuff. Not many bad things to say about this episode, just not one of my absolute favorites. Number 30, WEIRDMAGEDDON Part 2. Definitely the low point of the WEIRDMAGEDDON episodes, I think everyone can agree on that. It was fun to see a few glimpses into Dipper and Mabel's past, and the reunion of the twins at the end was well done and necessary, but the whole episode was so bright and silly, it felt extremely drawn out. I honestly feel like it would have been closer to the bottom of the list if it wasn't so important to the story. Number 29, the Stanchurian Candidate. This episode was fun. We got to see Gravity Falls do politics, and they had plenty of things to parody throughout the course of the episode. It gave us a solid plot, and Gideon back in the picture trying to sabotage Stan. Honestly, it's just a fun and refreshing episode that helped me get back into the mellowness of the show after Not What He Seems. Number 28, Little Dipper. In this episode, we get to see Gideon first express interest in the Mystery Shack, and I love it because he hints at the secrets that are held in there. Other than that, we get a solid plot with Mabel and Dipper arguing, causing yet again another disaster. Additionally, I find Stan especially funny in this episode. Next up at 27, Boss Mabel. I enjoyed this episode quite a bit, and seeing Stan on a game show was creative and did not disappoint. The plot with Mabel being a boss was good, not great. No complaints really, just a solid episode. 26, Roadside Attraction. I'm a firm believer that this episode gets way more hate than it deserves. Yes, it was supposed to air earlier in the season, and no, it doesn't include Ford, but it was a cool concept with interesting new characters, and it didn't disappoint. The idea that Dipper had moved on from Wendy was cool, and the concept of the main characters taking a road trip was well done, despite its placement in Season 2. At 25, I've got The Hand That Rocks the Mabel. It was the introduction to Little Gideon, and just a really solid episode altogether. Finding out Gideon had journal number 2 had me on the edge of my seat for what was to come. At number 24, The Last MABELCORN. Sure, the portion with Mabel and the unicorn was pretty meh, but the subplot with Dipper and Ford is just pure Gravity Falls. I love it so much that it more than makes up for the portions with Mabel and all the girls fighting annoying unicorns. When Dipper, and the audience, is convinced momentarily that Ford is with Bill, holy, what an episode. Number 23, Land Before Swine. A fun waddle-centric episode with dinosaurs, so obviously this was exciting to see happen. It was nice to see all the characters develop in different ways and move past their issues. Overall, it was just a fun episode with lots of rewatchability. It's also important to note that this is the last episode before Bill is introduced, so it was a nice wrap-up to the more conventional portion of the show. Number 22, Blendin's Game. I loved seeing Blendin return with another time travel episode, and the plot with SOOS was very well done and emotional. I also think this episode expanded from the Time Traveler's Pig in the way that it included references to the characters we already know and love. Number 21, Sock Opera. This episode was incredibly creative and featured a great addition to Bill in the plot. However, out of most of the Bill-centric episodes, this was one of my least favorite. That being said, they're all great, so that's why this is in number 21. The only part of this episode I didn't care for was Mabel having crazy crushes yet again and making Dipper suffer at the expense of that. Dipper mistakenly trusting Bill and Bill taking control of his body was great. I absolutely love what they did with this episode. Alright, well we are officially at our halfway point in the list, number 20, SUMMERWEEN. This would normally be lower on most people's lists, but this episode is higher up on mine for a few reasons. 1, I love Halloween, and 2, I love horror movies. It's amazing how this show manages to incorporate a Halloween episode that fits into the story perfectly in the middle of summer break. The Summerween trickster is both equally scary and cleverly implemented in a way where he could literally eat children and still be on Disney Channel. Coming in at number 19, Tourists Trapped, the pilot episode. What a classic. Not my favorite episode, but such a great pilot. Back when this episode aired, I was immediately hooked. I really don't think this episode deserves any lower than someplace in the top 20, but it's up for debate if it should be higher. Number 18, Double Dipper. One of my favorite Dipper and Wendy episodes, and it's just one of the classic episodes in the first season that just takes me back. This episode also introduces Pacifica and her feud with Mabel. I enjoy that side of the plot too, but Dipper and the clones clearly dominate this episode. Number 17, Carpet Diem. No clue why people have this any lower. I really enjoyed this episode. It hints at Ford's existence fairly early in Season 1, and has a classic body swap scenario implemented into the show in a great way. The scenes with Dipper, or technically Mabel, with Stan are some of my favorites in the entire show. Number 16, The Inconveniencing. A spooky episode that immediately became one of my favorites when it aired. We got a really creepy yet fun paranormal episode that introduces us to all of Wendy's friends. Overall, just one of the classic and iconic episodes during the beginning of the show. Also, Mabel having an acid trip was something I never knew I needed until the day this episode aired. Number 15, Legend of the Gobblewonker. Now why on earth do people hate this episode? I don't think it's extremely rewatchable just because you already know what's going to happen with the monster after the first watch, but it's still extremely solid. I also get to see some of my favorite Stan moments in this episode. Real ones know what I'm talking about. Next up at 14, the Time Traveler's Pig. What an episode. We get introduced to Blendin Blandin, and the time travel is done in such a perfect way. This episode also introduces Waddles and continues Mabel's feud with Pacifica. We also get to see our first look at Ford in this one, and the best part is nobody saw it coming at this point. Just always reminds me of how well thought out this show's overall story was. At number 13, WEIRDMAGEDDON Part 1. A fantastic beginning to the finale of this show. Bill taking over, the town being thrown into a complete apocalypse. Never would have expected this back in 2012 when I first watched Tourist Trapped. I think it's also worth noting that these last episodes have some of the coolest visuals I've ever seen on an animated show. Following up number 13 is, you guessed it, number 12, WEIRDMAGEDDON Part 3, Take Back the Falls. Now, many would group 3 and 4 together since I'm pretty sure they aired as one super long episode, but I'm just going off of how Disney Plus breaks it up, and Part 3 was quite the experience. We get to see everyone join together and take on Bill, followed up by the long teased joining of the main characters around the Zodiac. It all makes for some amazing fan service and outstanding execution. At number 11, Headhunters. Another example of a spectacular first few episodes that got me hooked. This episode had a chance for so many great references with the various wax figures, and it has some great symbolism that hints at the big reveal to come. Plus, it's a murder mystery, and who doesn't love that? And finally, moving into my top 10. Society of the Blind Eye. What a fantastic episode for so many reasons. It explains why nobody in this town seems to be aware of all the monsters and paranormal things that are happening there, and it explains Old Man McGucket's past in a way that made me rethink everything. Can't find much wrong with this episode, it's creepy and fun all at the same time. Number 9, Into the Bunker. This episode was just amazing. It features new and creepier creatures, a hidden bunker, and Dipper and Wendy finally dealing with their relationship in a healthy way. The vibe of this episode is so dark and foreboding, it's always been one of my favorites. Next up at number 8, SCARY-OKE. What a fantastic premiere for the second season of this show. We get to see the government agents begin to show interest in the town, and with Stan admit to Dipper that he's always known about all of the things that go on in this town. The opening of that episode is enough to have me hooked on season 2 in a matter of seconds. Number 7, Tale of Two Stans. The long-awaited follow-up to Not What He Seems, that answered all of our questions. We get to see Stan and Ford recall where it all went wrong, and give us a rundown of their lives up until this point. It was truly mind-blowing to see all of this play out. My only problem is that the scenes in between the flashbacks seem like the dialogue wasn't very well written, but that's honestly a really minor problem due to how great the rest of the episode is. I'm glad they gave this episode a longer runtime rather than just cutting things out because it really had a story to tell. In my 6th place, I've got the show's grand finale, WEIRDMAGEDDON 4. We get to see Bill in a crazier state than ever, and see him defeated in such a touching yet badass ending. I feel like this episode really wraps up the show perfectly, though my main problem is that it undoes Stan's sacrifice a bit and cheapens it. But that's not really a huge deal due to them executing the rest of the episode perfectly, but it's enough to keep this episode from ranking higher on the list. Breaking into my top 5, Dipper and Mabel vs. the Future. What an episode. Mabel and Dipper prepare for high school and their 13th birthday, and Ford offers Dipper to stay in the town with him, an offer that Dipper grows closer and closer to accepting while exploring an abandoned spaceship that caused the curious mountain formation in the town. It ends up being Dipper and Mabel's argument that causes Bill to escape from his prison and wreak havoc on the world. The end of this episode still gives me chills to this day. Number 4, Gideon Rises. What a great finale for Season 1. It showcases a fantastic showdown between Gideon and the Pines twins, as well as an ending that shocked me and I'm sure everyone else who was a fan of the show at the time. Let's just say the season finale was good enough to make the year that we had to wait for Season 2 feel like 3 years. Number 3, Northwest Mansion Mystery. I feel like this episode is massively slept on. The tone of this episode is unmatched, and it actually opens Pacifica up to have potential as a likable character. Dipper tracking down a terrifying lumberjack ghost who has sworn vengeance on the Northwest family was some of my favorite content from the show. And keeping in mind that this is the last episode before the big plot twist, the end of this episode is foreboding and creepy. And at number 2, Dreamscapers. The introduction to Bill Cipher. This episode is as iconic as it gets. We get to see everyone travel through Stan's mind, and it's equally as entertaining as it is interesting. There's so many things foreshadowed in this episode, it's insane. Feels like a lot of work was put into it, and boy did it pay off. Number 1, not what he seems. Now, I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise to most of you, because this episode was basically a full-blown movie packed into 20 minutes. It's everything this show has been about since the first episode leading up to this. I know that I've probably watched this episode most out of any of the other episodes, and that's saying something. From the build-up to the ending, this episode was perfect in every way, and I can't see how anyone could rank it any lower. Well, that's all for this video. Let me know what you agree with and disagree with in the comments below. Obviously, we're not going to have the same opinion on every single episode, so please keep in mind that it's only my opinion and be civil in the comments. All that aside, thank you so much for watching, and I hope all of you stay safe and have a good day. Peace.
Stop spitting and start shoplifting. I'm a nigga, so I'm not winning when the cops kill me. The ops come, we fought them, we lost some indeed. And the outcome, they drop one, they got you, they take shots, we pop two. Not talking no pistols, I'm talking those pills. When I'm talking about shots, yeah, I'm talking about kills. When America plots for the end of us all,